Rome fell. You know that part. What they don't tell you is what happened to the money. 70 million people watched 500 years of civilization evaporate in a single generation. Fortunes built over centuries, gone. Savings held in silver coins, worthless. The retirement funds of soldiers who'd bled for the frontier for 25 years, erased. And yet, some families came out of that collapse wealthier than they'd entered it. 4 assets protected them. 4 specific things that not only held value through one of history's most catastrophic economic implosions, they transferred enormous wealth to whoever was smart enough to hold them. One of those 4 assets is something every modern financial advisor would call reckless, dangerous, irresponsible. The Romans who held it didn't just survive the fall, they profited from it. To understand what survived, you first have to understand what killed the Roman economy. Because Rome didn't die from barbarians alone. It died from its money first. The denarius, Rome's silver coin, the economic heartbeat of an empire stretching from Scotland to Syria, was nearly 95% pure silver under Emperor Augustus. Every legionnaire's pay, every merchant's profit margin, every farmer's life savings was stored in that coin. It wasn't just currency, it was confidence in solid form. Then the bills started arriving. Running a frontier empire against simultaneous pressure from Germanic tribes in the north and the Sassanid Persians in the east cost money that no tax system on earth could generate fast enough. So the emperors did what governments throughout all of recorded history have done when they can't pay their obligations. They cheated the money. By the reign of Caracalla in the early 3rd century, the silver content of the denarius had fallen to roughly 50%. Coins looked identical, bore the same imperial seal, carried the same nominal value. Half the silver had quietly been replaced with bronze. By the mid-3rd century under Emperor Gallienus, a man who faced 23 rival claimants to his throne in just 15 years, the denarius contained less than 5% silver. Scratch the surface and it would flake away, revealing cheap metal underneath. The Roman people noticed. They always do. Prices rose. Merchants stopped accepting debased coins for imports. Soldiers demanded raises to compensate. Farmers abandoned their land rather than accept worthless money as payment for grain. The sophisticated trade network that had bound 70 million people together began fracturing at every seam. Between 235 and 284 AD, the period historians call the crisis of the 3rd century, Rome suffered military collapse, plague, civil war, and economic implosion simultaneously. 50 years of chaos. Nearly 50 emperors, most of them murdered within months of taking power. The empire that had stood for centuries was coming apart like wet paper. Against that backdrop, here is what actually held its value. Asset 1, the right kind of gold. Everyone will tell you gold survived Rome's fall. That's accurate. But the version of that story most people hear is dangerously incomplete. And the gap in that story has cost people fortunes in every collapse since. Here's the full picture. When Constantine the Great consolidated power in the early 4th century, he did something that looks simple in hindsight, but was a radical act of monetary reconstruction. In 312 AD, he introduced a new coin called the solidus. 24-karat gold, 4.5 grams, struck with consistent purity and precise weight across every mint in the empire. No debasement, no silver wash, no political games played with the metal content. The solidus wasn't just a coin, it was a declaration of war against the monetary destruction that had been rotting Rome from within for a century. The market responded immediately. Merchants, who had been conducting major transactions in grain and silk and raw materials, because nobody trusted the denarius, suddenly had a reliable medium of exchange again. The solidus became the currency of the wealthy, the internationally connected, and anyone who needed to conduct serious business across political boundaries. For the next 7 centuries, long after Rome's western half had dissolved into competing Germanic kingdoms, the solidus remained the backbone of Mediterranean commerce. Byzantine merchants were still trading in it in the 11th century. A Roman senator who held his wealth in debased denarii in 300 AD was financially destroyed by 360 AD. The same senator who had converted that position into gold, specifically into gold of verified consistent purity, maintained his economic standing through the worst of the collapse. But there is a layer to this that never makes it into the standard account. Not all gold was equal. The underground market for gold in 3rd century Rome was chaotic. Clipped coins, adulterated bars, fraudulent weights were everywhere. The men who survived weren't simply those who held gold. They were those who held gold that could be independently verified. Weighed, tested, trusted by a counterparty in a direct transaction without needing any institutional guarantee. Kyle Harper's research on Rome's economic collapse documents how the wealthy classes increasingly demanded payment in aurum, pure gold by weight, rather than in any specific coin denomination. They had already internalized the core lesson. The coin was a political instrument subject to manipulation. The metal itself was the store of value. That distinction between the asset and the paper claim on the asset is not a Roman problem. It is the permanent condition of any monetary system operating under stress. Rome didn't teach us that gold is safe. Rome taught us that what cannot be diluted cannot be debased. Which brings us to the most counterintuitive thing that happened during Rome's collapse. Sit with this for a moment before moving forward, because what comes next is the kind of insight that permanently reshapes how you read the history of money. Asset 2, debt. This is the one nobody talks about. Financial historians know it. The academic literature documents it with precision. It almost never surfaces in any mainstream conversation about Rome's fall. During Rome's hyperinflation, being a debtor was an asset. Here's exactly what that means. A Roman landowner takes out a loan of 100,000 denarii in 200 AD. At that point, those 100,000 denarii represent a genuine fortune, enough to acquire a productive agricultural estate outside the city. By 280 AD, 100,000 denarii buys approximately what a few sacks of grain cost in 200 AD. The silver content of the denarius has collapsed by over 90%. Prices have risen in lockstep. But the loan? The loan is still denominated in nominal denarii. The contract says 100,000 denarii, and 100,000 denarii is what gets repaid. Except those 100,000 denarii in 280 AD represent a tiny fraction of what they represented when the debt was created. The borrower repaid the loan in money that was functionally worthless. The lender, whoever had extended credit in good, silver-heavy denarii, received back bronze coins with a silver wash. Inflation didn't just erode the currency, it systematically transferred wealth from creditors to debtors on a massive empire-wide scale. Every fixed debt obligation, denominated in nominal denarii, became progressively cheaper to repay in real terms as the currency collapsed. The borrower's land remained. The debt's purchasing power did not. Roman historians document this pattern in the behavior of the senatorial class throughout the crisis. Those who had leveraged their land holdings with debt in the 2nd century found themselves, by the late 3rd century, holding enormous real assets. Productive farmland, urban properties, grain warehouses, while their debt obligations had been inflated away to near nothing. Peter Heather's analysis of the Roman aristocracy in the period immediately following the Western Empire's dissolution shows a striking pattern. The great landed families maintained extraordinary economic power even through the empire's final collapse. They weren't just surviving. Some were negotiating political arrangements with Visigothic and Frankish leaders from positions of genuine strength. Their debtor's advantage had given them something more valuable than liquid savings. It had given them real assets, unencumbered by obligations that once seemed crushing. Bryan Ward-Perkins, whose forensic archaeology of the post-Roman world documents the material evidence of collapse in objects and buildings and pottery shards, notes that while the standard of living for ordinary Romans collapsed catastrophically, the great villa estates of the aristocracy continued operating. Not at their peak, not with the complexity they'd maintained at the empire's height, but operating, producing, sustaining life within their walls. Joseph Tainter's framework for understanding systemic collapse points directly to this dynamic. When complex systems fail, they fail unevenly. The nodes that survive are those holding real productive capacity with minimal external dependencies. Roman aristocrats who held land with their debt obligations inflated away were precisely those nodes. Everything outside them was failing. Inside the estate walls, life went on. This pattern didn't begin with Rome. It didn't end there either. The Weimar hyperinflation of 1923 produced the identical dynamic with mathematical precision. German industrialists, who had borrowed heavily to build manufacturing capacity, paid off those loans in marks worth less than the paper they were printed on. They emerged owning real capital, free and clear, while their creditors, the savers, the bondholders, the retirees, were economically annihilated. Inflation is not simply a tax. It is a wealth transfer mechanism. And in that transfer, the direction of advantage has always run the same way, away from those who hold paper claims, toward those who hold real assets funded by debt in the collapsing currency. The Romans had no name for this principle, but the families who understood it, whether by intuition or calculation, came through the fall of an empire with their positions intact. Asset 3, the self-sufficient estate. Land alone didn't save you. This is a critical distinction that every simplified version of this story misses completely. Rome at its height was a deeply interconnected economy. Spanish olive oil shipped to Britain, Egyptian grain feeding the capital, Syrian purple dye clothing senators. The complexity of that supply chain was extraordinary for the ancient world, and when it fractured completely. A landowner whose estate depended on that trade network, who grew cash crops for export, who relied on imported tools, who needed urban markets to sell surplus, found himself stranded when the network stopped functioning. The supply chains that had made his land valuable vanished. The markets that had purchased his crops disappeared. His land was still there. Its economic function was gone. The estates that survived were built on an entirely different logic. The self-sufficient villa, a functioning Roman villa of the late imperial period, wasn't simply a farm. It was a closed-loop economy. Grain, vegetables, meat, timber, wool, leather, basic metalwork, all produced internally. The estate maintained its own smiths, its own carpenters, its own physicians for the laborers who worked it. Pottery fired in estate kilns. Cloth woven by estate workers. When the trade networks that had connected the empire contracted and eventually snapped, the self-sufficient villa didn't need them. It had never fully depended on them. Adrian Goldsworthy's examination of the late Roman period documents how the great villa estates of Britain, Gaul, and North Africa actually expanded their self-sufficiency infrastructure throughout the 3rd and 4th centuries, adding industrial workshops, enlarging grain storage, diversifying their agricultural output, precisely as the broader imperial economy was contracting around them. These were deliberate strategic decisions. The owners of these estates understood what the data was telling them. Complexity was becoming a liability. Self-sufficiency was the only hedge that couldn't be inflated away. There is another dimension to the villa story that deserves its own moment. The self-sufficient estate didn't just survive economically. It became a center of local political authority as the state progressively withdrew. When Roman tax collectors stopped appearing, when the legions disbanded for want of pay, when the roads became unsafe and local administration collapsed under the weight of its own dysfunction, the large villa owner filled the vacuum. He provided physical security. He provided food. He provided stable employment. He became, functionally, a local sovereign, the one constant in a landscape of dissolving institutions. Ward-Perkins documents how the social relationships that crystallized around the great villa estates in the post-Roman period became the template for what eventually evolved into medieval feudalism. The landowners who had diversified away from imperial dependency and built internal productive capacity didn't just hold their wealth through the collapse. They became the structural foundation of the next political order. That is not merely survival. That is what it looks like when an asset doesn't just endure a collapse. It defines what comes after. Asset 4, the irreplaceable skill. Here is the sorting mechanism that every economic collapse applies without mercy or exception. Your credential doesn't matter. The institution that validated your expertise doesn't matter. When the institutional framework that gave that credential its exchange value collapses, the credential collapses with it. What Rome's fall revealed, and what every subsequent collapse has confirmed in every culture and century since, is that only 2 categories of human capability maintain genuine exchange value when currencies fail and supply chains dissolve. The first is the skill that addresses an immediate, unavoidable human need. The physician who can treat infection without imported medicines from the eastern trade routes. The blacksmith who can forge a plow blade from scrap iron. The miller who can turn grain into flour with nothing but stone and leverage. The carpenter who can repair a roof before the winter rains arrive. These people could eat in Rome's darkest years, not because they held coins or land or complex debt arrangements. They could eat because what they produced could not be withheld, could not be inflated away, and could not be replaced by any political decree. A farmer whose plow breaks in April needs a blacksmith that week. That need exists whether the denarius is worth a gram of silver or a gram of bronze, whether the emperor on the coin has been assassinated or merely fled. The second is the skill that enables commerce across collapsing boundaries. Rome's disintegration didn't eliminate all trade. It fragmented it. And in a fragmented landscape, the merchant who could operate across multiple competing political units, speaking multiple languages, maintaining trusted relationships in multiple jurisdictions, moving goods across borders that kept shifting as Germanic kingdoms carved up former Roman territory, was worth his weight in the solidest coins he traded in. Kyle Harper's documentation of the late Roman period shows that certain trading networks, particularly those connecting the eastern Mediterranean ports, maintained activity well into the post-Roman centuries, not at Roman scale, but functioning. The operators of those networks were not Roman citizens in any meaningful political sense by the time the Western Empire formally ended. They were traders with skills, relationships, and a portable stock of trusted hard currency. The state had dissolved around them. Their economic function had not. What happened to the Roman professionals, whose value was purely institutional, the lawyers whose practice depended on Roman civil law courts that ceased to function, the imperial administrators whose salaries came from a treasury that went bankrupt, the military logistics officers, of an army that disbanded when it couldn't be paid? They struggled, not universally. Some adapted, repurposing their knowledge in ways that served the new political realities. But the collapse exposed the fragility at the core of credential-based economic identity with devastating clarity. Your value in a failing system is only as durable as the system itself. The craftsman, the physician, the merchant with a portable skill set. These were the people who didn't just survive the fall of Rome. They were the ones who trained the children of the aristocrats who survived. who serviced the villas that became feudal estates, who carried the practical technical knowledge of Roman civilization forward through centuries that we call the Dark Ages, which were dark partly because so much institutional knowledge evaporated while craft knowledge survived. Joseph Tainter's analysis of collapsing societies identifies this with precision. Complex societies maintain specialists whose entire economic function depends on the maintenance of that complexity. When complexity collapses, those specialists become redundant. The skills that survive are invariably those that function at lower levels of complexity. Skills that work when supply chains have broken, when institutions have failed, when the state has fragmented into local strongmen and warlord territories. Rome didn't preserve its legal system through the fall. It didn't preserve its administrative architecture or its financial sophistication. What it preserved, imperfectly but genuinely, were its carpenters, its physicians, its grain farmers, and its metalworkers, the people who could do the irreducible things that kept human beings alive, regardless of who held political power. So here is what 4 Roman assets reveal about the permanent mechanics of collapse. Gold survived, but only the gold you could verify, weigh, and use in a direct transaction without institutional intermediaries. The paper claim on gold evaporated, the metal endured. Debt in collapsing currency survived, not as a burden, but as a hidden mechanism for transferring real wealth from those who lent to those who borrowed. The Roman families who held land purchased with loans denominated in debased denarii came through one of history's most complete economic catastrophes with their positions intact, sometimes improved. Self-sufficient land survived, but only the land that had deliberately severed its dependence on the complexity surrounding it. The villa estate that could feed, clothe, and shelter its people without reference to trade networks or imperial supply chains didn't just endure the collapse. It became the nucleus of what came next. And irreplaceable skills survived. The capability to address fundamental human needs when everything else has failed. The portable knowledge that no political collapse can confiscate, no inflation can erode, no invading king can make obsolete. 4 assets, all of them rooted in one principle that Rome taught with blood and with bronze coins wearing a thin silver mask. What survives a collapse is not what the system values most in prosperity. What survives is what cannot be faked, cannot be diluted, and cannot be made redundant when the system itself is gone. Rome's emperors believed they could print their way out of a fiscal crisis by striking more coins from cheaper metal. They believed a coin that looked like silver was functionally equivalent to silver. They believed the complexity and scale of their empire was proof of its permanence. The complexity was the vulnerability. The scale made the unraveling faster, not slower. And here is the thought worth carrying with you. Every modern financial system is more complex than Rome at its height. Every modern currency is more thoroughly decoupled from tangible value than the most aggressively debased denarius. Every modern supply chain contains more single points of failure than the entire Roman trade network at its most stretched. Rome fell slowly, then all at once. If this changed how you think about money, about what holds value, about what the survivors of history's greatest collapses actually held, subscribe. History has the answers. I'll show you where to look.